So picture this. It's the early hours of August 7th, 1959, and you're a commercial airline pilot flying high over the state of Oregon.
Right.
You look down, and you see something that just absolutely chills your blood. Erupting from the ground is this massive 2,000-foot-tall mushroom cloud of fire and smoke.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely understandable why, for a terrifying few hours, people in the region genuinely thought the Cold War had gone hot.
Oh, exactly.
They thought the Soviet Union had just dropped a nuclear bomb right on the Pacific Northwest.
Because the shockwave was, it was huge, right?
Oh, massive. It shattered windows 8 miles away. The boom was actually heard in a completely different city, Eugene, which is, over an hour's drive north.
That is wild. But the truth was actually much stranger, and it was entirely homegrown.
Yeah, it wasn't a nuke.
No. It was a single truck parked in the absolute worst place imaginable. And today we're taking a deep dive into the documents surrounding that truck and the city sitting right underneath that mushroom cloud, which is Roseburg, Oregon.
Which is such a fascinating place.
It really is. Because our mission today isn't just to look at a crazy historical explosion. We're looking at how a single geographic location, the Umpqua Valley, survives being literally and economically wiped off the map.
Right, multiple times.
Exactly. We're going to explore how a place transitions from a 10,000-year indigenous equilibrium to a rugged timber boom town, survives a literal crater in its downtown, and manages to engineer a totally new economic identity. Okay, let's unpack this.
That's the real core of this deep dive, because the history of the Umpqua Basin, which is bordered by the Cascade Range on one side and the Coast Range on the other, it's essentially a masterclass in adaptation.
Yeah.
Human history on a landscape isn't static. It's incredibly fluid. It's driven by geography, by sheer force of will, and, as we'll see with that truck, by staggering human negligence.
To really understand how a town rebuilds from a 50-foot crater, you first have to understand the foundational DNA of the people who originally mastered that landscape. Long before anyone was logging Douglas firs, this valley was a perfectly balanced engine.
For thousands of years. I mean, we're talking about an indigenous equilibrium tied directly to the valley's Mediterranean climate and its highly complex hydrological cycles.
Rivers, basically.
Exactly. The primary artery for all life and economy there was the Umpqua River watershed. And while several indigenous groups called this area home, the history heavily focuses on the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua tribe of Indians.
And what really jumps out is that they weren't just, passively foraging. Their land management was brilliant engineering.
Oh, absolutely.
Take their fishing methods during the salmon runs. They built these intricate weirs in the rivers and used funnel-shaped traps woven out of wild hazel bark.
The physics behind those hazel basket traps is a phenomenal example of applying fluid dynamics to agriculture.
Wait, really? Fluid dynamics?
Yeah, they didn't just throw a net in the water. They designed a funnel shape so that the sheer weight and current of the rushing river would physically hold the silver salmon and steelhead inside the trap. Once a fish swam in, it couldn't generate enough force to swim backwards against that artificial pressure vacuum. It's a highly efficient, sustainable method of harvesting massive amounts of protein.
And their knowledge of the local flora wasn't just about food, though they obviously relied heavily on acorns and the decamas root. It was a deeply understood pharmacy.
Yeah.
Like if someone suffered a burn, they used snakeweed. If a child had a fever, they brought it down with wild ginger. They knew exactly what the land could carry and what it could cure.
But that 10,000-year balance was shattered essentially overnight.
Right.
The mid-19th century brought frontier expansion to the Pacific Northwest, and the destruction was incredibly rapid. In 1851, gold was discovered in the Illinois River and near Jacksonville.
And that triggered a massive influx of miners.
Exactly. And we aren't talking about a few guys panning quietly in a stream. They used hydraulic mining.
Right. And for anyone who isn't familiar with 19th century mining, hydraulic mining isn't just digging. It's literally blasting the hillsides apart with high-pressure water cannons.
Yes. You strip mine the earth using water. And as a result, massive amounts of silt and debris wash directly down into the river systems.
Which ruins the rivers.
Completely.
Yeah.
That silt clogs the gills of the salmon and buries the gravel beds where they spawn. So in a matter of months, the primary food source that had sustained the Cow Creek Band for millennia was suffocating.
And if the rivers were being destroyed, the land was getting it just as bad. Because in 1850, the federal government passed the Donation Land Claim Act to incentivize white settlement in the Oregon Territory.
Which basically meant free acreage to any white settler willing to cultivate it.
Right. So settlers start pouring in, and they bring non-native livestock. They bring cattle, and those cows just trample and decimate the fields of camas bulbs, which was a vital carbohydrate for the indigenous population.
Yeah.
Then the settlers bring hogs, and the hogs root up and eat all the acorns. So between the silt, the cows, and the hogs, the foundational food supply of the Cow Creek Band is completely wiped out by frontier agriculture.
And that aggressive ecological destruction forces the tribes into a desperate corner, which sets up the treaty era. In 1853, the U.S. government sends General Joel Palmer to negotiate with the Cow Creek Band,
Right.
and the resulting Treaty of 1853 is one of the most glaring examples of structural imbalance you'll ever see in legal history. For starters, General Palmer negotiated this using English and Chinook jargon.
Wait, Chinook jargon, that's not a full language, is it?
No, it's a very basic trade pidgin. It had maybe a few hundred words total. It was meant for trading furs, not for navigating complex legal concepts like permanent land cessions and sovereign rights.
Oh, wow.
So the tribal leaders couldn't possibly understand the full binding legal scope of what they were being pressured to sign.
That is a completely flawed premise from minute one. And then, I mean, you look at the actual math of the deal. The tribe was forced to cede 800 square miles of their ancestral homeland.
Yeah.
That's about 512,000 acres. And the price the government paid them, $12,000.
It's unbelievable.
If you're listening to this and doing the math, that breaks down to roughly 2.3 cents per acre.
What's fascinating here is that exact same land was immediately turned around and sold to white settlers under the Donation Land Claim Act for $1.25 per acre.
It's the ultimate unethical real estate flip.
Literally.
Think about your own house or apartment right now. Imagine someone destroys your kitchen so you're starving, forces you to sign a contract in a language you don't speak to buy your property for pennies, and then flips it the next day for a 50-fold profit to build their own empire.
Yeah, that puts it into perspective.
It takes a dry historical date like 1853 and shows you the stark, brutal reality of how a civilization is upended.
And to make matters worse, the treaty promised healthcare, housing, and education in exchange for that land. Those stipulations were completely ignored by the government for nearly a century.
Wow.
Native people were forced onto reservations in harsh winter conditions, a devastating march where many died. Though it is crucial to note that several Cow Creek families absolutely refused to leave.
Right.
They retreated deep into the rugged, remote mountains of the South Umpqua watershed and managed to survive in seclusion.
That massive, cheap acquisition of land essentially created a vacuum, practically begging ambitious, ruthless opportunists to rush in and stake their claim. Which brings us to a guy who quite literally bought his way onto the map, Aaron Rose.
Oh, yes, Aaron Rose.
Mm.
He was a merchant who traveled out from Michigan and arrived in September 1851.
Okay.
He had a very sharp eye for geography, and he saw the strategic value of one specific spot, the confluence of Deer Creek and the South Umpqua River. He bought squatters' rights, filed a land claim, and opened a tavern.
A tavern.
Yeah. Initially, the settlement was just called Deer Creek, operating as a rest stop for packers and teamsters on the Oregon-California Trail.
But Aaron Rose wasn't a guy who just wanted to own a roadside diner. He wanted political relevance. Douglas County had just been created in 1852, and the original county seat was in a nearby settlement called Winchester.
Right.
Rose wanted that county seat moved to his property, so he basically buys the 1854 election.
Yeah, he does.
He donates 3 acres of his own land and $1,000 in cash, specifically to build a new county courthouse right on his property.
It was incredibly aggressive, localized lobbying.
But hold on, why did that actually work? Did the pioneer voters really just want a free building?
Yes, because it appealed to frontier pragmatism. Building a courthouse required tax money. These were early settlers who didn't have a lot of liquid cash.
Oh, I see.
When Rose offered free land and $1,000 to construct the Civic Center, he was effectively offering the voters a massive tax break. They voted for their wallets.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Pure economic incentive. So he wins the election, the county seat moves, and the town is renamed Roseburg in 1857 to honor him. They eventually drop the H at the end in 1894.
Right. It shows how sheer willpower and localized infrastructure can define a region. But the real game changer for Roseburg's infrastructure arrived in 1872. That's when Ben Holliday built the Oregon and California Railroad right through the town.
This is the moment the town stops being a pioneer rest stop and becomes an industrial machine. Before the railroad, exporting anything out of Roseburg was a nightmare.
Oh, terrible.
In 1868, they had to haul 17 heavy wagons full of wool over terrible terrain all the way to Scottsburg just to get it on a ship to San Francisco. The railroad made heavy export routine.
It instantly connected Roseburg to the Willamette Valley and the Pacific coast, and it totally shifted the town's urban geography.
How so?
An entire working-class neighborhood called Mill Pine sprang up southeast of downtown to house the railroad and mill workers. If you walk through there today, it's still a historic district filled with modest rural Gothic and Queen Anne cottages, those classic steep-roofed wooden houses you always see in old western mill towns.
And the people living in those steep-roof cottages eventually transitioned from shipping agricultural goods to the industry that would become Roseburg's entire personality.
Timber.
Timber, yes. By the mid-20th century, the town was banking everything on wood products. In 1937, Kenneth Ford established Roseburg Lumber, which quickly became the largest private employer in the county.
Right.
They were churning out insane amounts of plywood and lumber from local stands of Douglas fir, spruce, and hemlock.
The post-World War II housing boom required a staggering amount of timber, and Roseburg had the supply. By the 1970s, the city officially claimed the title Timber Capital of the Nation.
That's quite a title.
Everything revolved around the mills, the steam whistles dictated the time of day, logging trucks were constantly roaring down Highway 99. It forged a very specific, rugged identity for the city.
An identity so potent that Johnny Cash literally mythologized it.
Yeah, he did.
He recorded a song called Lumberjack that painted the loggers in Roseburg as these larger-than-life giants. But while they were cutting down the forests, the city was smart enough to build out other pillars of infrastructure.
They did. As early as 1894, they established the Oregon State Soldiers' Home for Veterans, which eventually evolved into a massive 114-acre Veterans Administration Hospital campus by 1933, specializing in neuropsychiatric care.
Wow.
Later, in 1964, Umpqua Community College was founded to provide technical training.
But even with a hospital and a college, you still have an entire city banking its survival, its culture, and its economy on a single commodity. So what does this all mean for a town when its entire cultural and economic identity becomes tied to a single resource like timber? If you put all your eggs in one basket, what happens when somebody drops the basket?
Well, you expose the community to deep underlying vulnerability. A mono-economy means if one central thing goes wrong, the ripple effect destroys everything. And that vulnerability became horrifyingly literal on a quiet summer night, August 7th, 1959.
The 1959 Roseburg blast.
Yeah.
This is the moment where the town is almost completely undone by one guy's terrible parking job.
The sequence of events is chilling. It starts at 1:14 a.m. with a standard fire at the Garrettson Building Supply Company at the intersection of Oak and Pine Streets. Okay.
Firefighters arrive and start fighting the blaze.
Yeah.
What they don't know is what is parked right in front of the burning building.
A truck driver named George Rutherford, who worked for the Pacific Powder Company, had parked his delivery truck right next to the building. And he did this despite explicit warnings from the city not to leave explosives parked in congested commercial areas.
Right, and his payload wasn't just fireworks. He was hauling 2 tons of dynamite and 4.5 tons of nitrocarbonate.
Which is essentially a massive fertilizer bomb.
Basically, yeah.
It's a mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. He parked 6.5 tons of high explosives next to a fire.
When the flames reached that truck, the detonation was beyond catastrophic.
Yeah.
It instantly vaporized the truck and blew a crater into the earth that was 20 feet deep and over 50 feet across.
That's the blast that created the 2,000-foot mushroom cloud we talked about at the beginning. People genuinely thought it was a Soviet nuke. Yeah.
14 people were killed instantly, including police officer Donald D'Souza and assistant fire chief Roy McFarland, who died trying to evacuate people away from the fire. Over 125 people were severely injured, and 30 entire city blocks sustained structural damage.
It caused an estimated $10 to $12 million in damage in 1959 money. The scene was so chaotic, they had to bring in 100 National Guard troops just to patrol Ground Zero to prevent looting, while rescue workers sifted through the rubble.
That's devastating.
It was such a profound disaster that it forced the Interstate Commerce Commission to totally overhaul national regulations for how explosives are transported on American highways.
But here's where the story pivots. Because the blast should have been the end of Roseburg. But they recover, and the mechanism of their recovery is totally fascinating.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a masterclass in urban resilience. The city bounced back almost immediately because 98% of the affected businesses carried insurance policies that specifically covered explosions.
Okay, wait, hold on. Here's where it gets really interesting. Why on earth did 98% of businesses in a remote Oregon timber town carry highly specialized explosion insurance in 1959? Was that just a normal thing people bought?
It wasn't normal everywhere, but it was surprisingly standard in timber and milling towns.
Oh, because of the mills.
Exactly. Lumber mills generate massive amounts of highly combustible sawdust. A spark in a mill could cause a dust explosion that would level a building. Because of that ever-present risk, industrial fire insurance policies in towns like Roseburg frequently had explosion clauses baked right into them.
That is an incredible dark irony. The town is practically wiped off the map by a completely avoidable human error, a guy ignoring parking rules, but they're saved by a bizarrely specific bureaucratic safety net.
Yeah, it's wild.
Because they had that explosion insurance, they didn't have to wait years for federal urban renewal funds. They just got their checks and started rebuilding downtown instantly.
They cleared the rubble, built a new bridge over the South Umpqua River to improve traffic flow, and got right back to work. But physical rebuilding was only half the battle. Because right as they rebuilt their storefronts, the foundational pillar of their economy, the timber industry, started to collapse.
Right, the wood was running out.
Yeah.
Or rather, new environmental regulations and shifting global markets meant they couldn't cut it down at the same booming rate. Roseburg physically survived the crater, but now they had to economically survive losing their identity.
And they did it by looking back at the soil. In the late 20th century, a man named Richard Sommer made a massive viticultural gamble.
A wine gamble.
Exactly. He looked at the Umpqua Valley and saw potential that academic experts completely dismissed.
Yeah.
In 1961, he established Hillcrest Vineyard and planted the very first Pinot Noir vines in Oregon.
And I love this detail. He did it by entirely ignoring his professors at UC Davis.
He really did.
The academic consensus in California was that Oregon's climate was way too cold for delicate European wine grapes. But Sommer ignored them, planted his vines, and essentially birthed the entire modern Oregon wine industry.
Because what Sommer recognized was exactly what the indigenous populations had known thousands of years prior. This valley's geography is highly unique.
Right.
In 1984, the region was officially designated as the Umpqua Valley AVA, or American Viticultural Area. Its microclimates are incredibly diverse because it sits right at the collision point between the cooler Willamette Valley to the north and the warmer Rogue Valley to the south.
It's the perfect geographical middle ground. And in 1995, Earl and Hilda Jones of Abasella Winery proved just how versatile the soil was. They planted the very first Tempranillo in the Pacific Northwest.
Wow.
They proved this single valley could sustain cool climate grapes like Pinot Noir right alongside warm climate Spanish and Portuguese varietals like Albarino. Today, there are over 30 wineries producing more than 40 different varietals. They basically replaced the timber mills with tasting rooms.
It is a phenomenal economic pivot, but perhaps the most profound reinvention and truly the most important full-circle moment in this region's history belongs to the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua tribe of Indians.
The people who were forced to give up 500,000 acres for pennies in 1853.
Exactly. Their modern resurgence is one of the most powerful legal and economic comebacks in American history. To understand it, you have to look at 1954, when the federal government passed the Western Oregon Indian Termination Act. Under that act, the tribe actually lost their federal recognition entirely. They were rendered legally landless.
What does that actually mean in practice? Legally landless.
It means the federal government effectively erased their sovereign existence on paper to avoid honoring any historical treaty obligations, like the healthcare and education they were promised back in 1853. It was an administrative dilution.
That's awful.
But the Cow Creek Band fought back relentlessly for decades. Finally, in 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed their Recognition Act, officially restoring their federal status as a sovereign tribe.
And they didn't stop at just getting recognized. In 1984, they took the federal government to court over that unconscionable 1853 treaty, and they won.
They argued that the original treaty lacked conscionable consideration, meaning the 2.3 cents per acre was so outrageously low, it violated basic legal fairness. The court agreed, awarding them a land claim settlement of $1.5 million.
That's a huge victory.
And instead of just dividing that money up, the tribe put it into a permanent endowment. They used it to fund a massive engine of economic development.
Today, the Cow Creek Tribe is the largest employer in all of Douglas County. They run the Seven Feathers Casino Resort. They They operate multiple businesses, and they are leading massive environmental restoration projects across thousands of acres of their ancestral homeland.
It's an absolutely stunning reversal.
The indigenous land management principles of the past are now working in parallel with the sustainable agriculture of the modern vineyards.
And the city actively preserves this layered history. If you visit, you can see the Douglas County Museum, which was built in 1969. It's this beautiful, modern architectural space that houses 10,000 years of artifacts.
Very cool.
And right nearby, the 1854 Flood Lane House still stands, preserving the pioneer era. They haven't paved over their history, they've integrated it.
It reminds me of the agricultural concept of crop rotation.
Oh, how so?
Well, if you plant the exact same crop, like a monoeconomy of timber year after year, it drains all the nutrients and the soil eventually dies. But if you walk away from that monoculture, the soil recovers, and it has the capacity to yield something completely new and entirely different.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Today, that new yield is world-class wine, modern healthcare at the VA hospital, and the massive economic engine of the tribal enterprise.
That's a perfect way to look at it. This raises an important question, though. The story of Roseburg proves that the final chapter of a place is never truly written. It just waits for the next adaptation.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. Because the shortcut to being truly well-informed today isn't just memorizing the trivia of how Aaron Rose bought an election or the date a truck blew up.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that the places we live in are not static monuments. They are constantly being destroyed and reborn by new infrastructure, by sudden tragedy, and by stubborn visionaries who refuse to take no for an answer.
Absolutely.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to mull over. Take a hard look at your own city, or even your own profession right now. We've seen how the Umpqua Valley survived by pivoting from indigenous ecological balance to pioneer agriculture to a booming timber capital to a world-class wine destination.
Yeah.
If your town's primary industry or your own foundational identity vanished overnight like a dynamite truck exploding on Main Street, what are the hidden seeds in your own soil? Just waiting to grow a completely new ecosystem. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We will see you next time.